Fox Business Alert. A federal appeals court ruling moments ago that most of President Trump's tariffs are not legal. The ruling goes into effect October 14th.
And let's turn it over to our own Lydia Hu. Lydia.
Hi, good evening to you both, Dagan and James. This decision coming out just in about the last 30 minutes. It is decided by the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit and is being handed down on a per curiam basis, meaning not issued by any one particular judge, but on behalf of the entire panel, which in this case was 11 judges, which is unusual by most standards. Usually we would have a panel of 3 judges. That was really seen as a signal of just how critically important this case was to this judicial body. 11 judges deciding this case. And to your point, they decided that Trump's use of the IEEPA tariffs, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, used to implement the fentanyl tariffs as well as the universal reciprocal tariffs, is not permitted by IEEPA. So they are affirming the lower court that initially decided that, and they are giving until October 14th for this decision to go into place. That means for now, Dagan and James, those tariffs will still remain in place. Just to remind everyone, this case was brought by a group of 5 businesses as well as a group of roughly a dozen Democratic attorney generals who challenged these IEEPA tariffs essentially on the grounds of a separation of powers issue. Very simply stated, they basically said the power to impose tariffs belongs to Congress and only the president can do so in a few limited circumstances. And finding that there is a national emergency based on the flow of drugs, these attorneys generals and the small businesses argued did not rise to an emergency level, and that was the heart of their challenge, and this appellate court is essentially agreeing with them. Very clearly, this is now setting up an argument that will head to the U.S. Supreme Court, so I would anticipate we're going to see a writ of certiorari, which is a request for judicial review to the High Court, and or an emergency petition being filed in the not too distant future. A couple of practical notes here that the Trump administration has been very clear in emphasizing all along the way. You know, Trump selected, they say, the use of IEEPA tariffs because of the flexibility, his ability to implement them in a speedy fashion. But that's not his only option here. So I believe that moving forward here, we'll likely hear them talk about other options that President Trump likely has to impose tariffs in the absence of the IEEPA tariffs. He could look to sections like Section 201, Section 122. They could also allow him to implement tariffs on a particularized sectoral basis, although they're not as flexible as the IEEPA options are. Another option that has been discussed is that he could possibly ask Congress to bless his use of tariffs. It might seem like a far-fetched idea, but I would suggest to you, now that he's bringing in billions of dollars per year, it seems, based on these tariffs, perhaps Congress likes the way that money looks on the balance sheet, and they may consider actually blessing his use of tariffs. Finally, I would just flag, tariff negotiations, trade negotiations ongoing with major trade partners like China. One has to wonder, are they watching this? And maybe that's an issue that they will be discussing in the not too distant future, perhaps. But I'll send it back to you after all of that.
Lydia Hu, you just crushed it, lady. You crushed it. You covered all the bases. So the tariffs are bringing in, Lydia, we'll see you shortly. The tariffs are bringing in, based on Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent's recent estimate, roughly $400 billion a year. And you've even started to hear Democrats and people on the left applaud what is, in essence, a little sliver of a value-added tax that's been applied to imports into this country. But the president and the White House were using the IEEPA, the International Emergency Powers Act, saying that the trade deficit was the emergency that they were addressing with the reciprocal tariffs.
Yeah, I think Lydia makes a great point about how these tariffs, although we're seeing courts affirming pretty decisively here that they are not legal, politicians are going to want this money. And to your point about Bessent's estimate, it's in line with the Congressional Budget Office. They're saying $4 trillion over 10 years or more total tariff revenue under the new Trump stuff. Well, this basically entirely offsets his income tax restraint in the one big beautiful bill. So if you're looking for economic growth, this is, I think, great news that that maybe the one big beautiful bill and all of its pro-growth incentives are not going to be offset by tariffs. But again, as Lydia said, the problem here is the politicians may want the money, and even Democrats who don't like Trump may say, well, maybe we should bless this.
Right.
But the taxing power has to go through Congress. The tariff power has to go through Congress.
I said all along, the danger is that you implement the very beginnings of a consumption tax or a value-added tax, and we wind up like Europe, where you get both. You're taxing consumption and income, or taxing consumption and work, and we don't want to be Europe.